Forward on this computer. Perfect. So,
surely a pause on a bench squat's unnecessary, no?
I mean, you've got them programmed this week as well, mate, so you can pipe down.
It's the only thing I can do.
I knew as soon as I hit record, Gobby Talisha would pop up.
Right, she's clean. I've still got nothing.
She's gone on mute. She's on mute. Right. Thanks very much for joining. Obviously, we've kind of added this one in as a lockdown 2.0 and just try to entertain some of those people that are locked down and try and keep some kind of community going and keep a joined up approach. Frustratingly, we've not really had any competitions at all this year. It is my intention, whether it's to be done at Blockhouse or whether I end up or we end up with Claire on here as well as part of the committee, actually getting into the club in Andover, setting it up so we can actually then run a few kind of maximal efforts. It won't be any sort of competition style, but it will be hopefully an opportunity to get a few people in a room and max out as best as we can, kind of thing. I love the way we've now got people just waving and saying hello whilst on mute. It's brilliant. So that's kind of my intentions. Obviously, it depends on what Boris is looking to do. But today, we are looking to just have a discussion based around the bench press, effectively. This one has actually probably been the hardest for me to put together, because the more you look into bench press, the more of the technical aspect probably gets missed. As those of you that have seen the presentations I've done before or been on workshops and things, I tend to break things down into certainly the powerlifting movements, in the constants and the variables that are within each movement. So those that have to stay true throughout each movement, and those things that can be manipulated within each movement to either gain an eliciting force advantage or a range of movement or a within the rules advantage within the sport. The bench is probably the one that gives you the most advantage, and the setup is absolutely crucial. So what I will do, and I'll probably cut a couple of times into, Susie has kindly sent me a couple of videos that we can use as well. So we can probably use that to have a little goosies at techniques and the difference between the positioning. But for now, without further ado, we will share my screen. We should have a nice, pretty presentation for you all. Good. Give us a thumbs up if you can see that bad boy. Perfect. I wasn't going to
interrupt. I can't hear. I can barely hear you. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing the same thing.
No, Craig, you're loud and clear to me. So
Yeah, same here.
Can you turn your volume up on the right on your phone? How about that? Any better?
I could hear you earlier. Tell me when you start recording. Right?
Oh no. What we'll do is we'll carry on, James. Worst thing we can do, mate, is I'll send you the recording and we can go over that. But I have noted that you have asked a question through the group as well, so we'll make sure we cover that as well. So the sections we're going to look to go through, I always like to start with reflections. I've got 3 today, which we'll start at the beginning and we'll start as we go through. We'll look at the objectives, what we're looking to actually learn and actually gain from the barbell with itself. Look at the constants and variables, as I've said before. Look at the setup and the options. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to look at going through what the original bench press that probably everybody started with the old school, go in 3 sets of 10, lay on the bench, off you go kind of bench press, and then how it derives into the powerlifting variants that we've got. The key takeaways that we probably need to be mindful of whilst we're using and going through the bench press. Summary and reflection, and obviously questions and everything else. So without further ado, this is probably one that is really kind of pivotal for me. One of the Socrates quotes, I cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think. And this is one of the biggest things I looked to try and take or create with these Sunday sessions. I have some knowledge, I don't have all of the knowledge, and the biggest thing for me is giving people the opportunity to understand what's going on, what should be happening, why it's happening, and what they can do about it. So they don't become reliant upon me, they're working with me. Anyone that's done any coaching and stuff with me, I hope gets that kind of feeling from me as a coach. Another really good one from Henry Ford. It's one that I bring out to my son quite a lot. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. I suppose it's that positive mental attitude side of things. Obviously, from a coaching and athlete perspective, there is that guidance side of things that comes into it, and the reflection that comes through that as well. James, you are a noisy bugger. James, you are going on mute. And then we've also got my third one, which is probably the slightly humorous, but it's also very pertinent. Two things are infinite. The universe and human stupidity, and I'm not sure about the universe, which is a really interesting one from Albert Einstein, and it probably gives us an indication that all of the levels of stupid that we have going about right now, certainly throughout the country, maybe even the world right now, with the whole COVID side of things, is not just in this instance, it's been a historical thing. So this one we've used before. Again, it's something I kind of bang on quite a lot. The objective of the lift itself is looking at the basic principles of biomechanics. We have that prevention of injury side of things. So as far as we'd be concerned with certainly with powerlifting or weightlifting, any sport in itself, if you're not training, you're not gaining. So there's no, if you're spending time on that injury table or you're having to correct certain patterns of movement and things like that, you know, you're not going to be making the best as you can out of that. But obviously we want to maximize that performance and that sporting potential. Which brings us to this awkward looking bad boy. We have the original bench press. The original flat bodybuilder bench press, standard positions. So when originally you go in and teach this, and obviously I've done my level 2 qualifications, level 3 qualifications as a gym instructor. Foot position generally is flat on the floor, knee position roughly 90 degrees directly underneath the feet, hip position on the bed, shoulder position on the bed, head position on the bed, the bar comes straight down, straight up. It's a chest exercise. And that's kind of all we kind of look at. The idea behind the movement is that it develops the strength or the pushing strength of the upper body and nothing else. But when we look at the powerlifting context of that, we then look at what the rules and regulations are. So fourth one down there, federation and competition rules. So the idea already, going back to this one, is to lift as much weight as possible. So if we're aiming to lift as much weight as possible, that's probably only going to get us so far. So within the federation and competition rules, we have to have a pause on the chest. We have to have 5 points of contact. So both feet, your hips, your shoulders, and your head must be in contact with either the floor or the bed at all times. The constant of that foot position, the feet cannot move. So if the feet move completely, so they shift laterally or they raise up and down again throughout the movement, there is a no lift. Your contact positions on the bench, they need to be consistent as they go. The technique-wise, your body contact points, so as the bar comes down and makes contact with the chest, it comes back up. In an ideal world, if you are training the same pattern of movement all the time, that contact point should be the same all the time. And that's going to depend on the setup. So the setup here, and I know I've mentioned it already, the setup here is massive, because if you're not executing it exactly the same way every single time, unless it's a specific variant with a training assistant, then you're not going to be training that key pattern of movement. You're not going to be developing the strength, the neural pathways, and executing exactly the same way every time. And then we have those variables, which we'll come to as we go through. But again, those body contact points of, and this is more pertinent to, and I know we've got body contact points on the variables and on the constants, but those body contact points can move in that technical position. So where your shoulders and where your hips start now, and where you change those positions in 2 to 3 months' time might be slightly different to gain that anthropometrical advantage. Foot position, again, depending on where and what you want to achieve from your technique, is going to depend on where that foot position is. And that's completely different for everybody. And one of the things I tend to encourage people, Susie's probably one of the best and the worst for this, is to just have a little play, move everything by 0.5 centimetre to feel what feels right. Then have a period of training where we keep that position. And then if it doesn't feel quite right, have a little move again and have a play. And again, that comes into that athlete-coach relationship, which is really, really important. To arch or not to arch? That is the question. And there's a massive debate on arching or not arching. And again, we can go back to this one. There's the goal. Lift as much weight as possible. but we also need to prevent injury and we need to maximize that performance. So it's that trade-off of how much do you go to risk injury to maximize performance to lift that weight as much as possible. So we come back through to, so what now? Which style do I choose? And this one, this is the only bit I've really typed out. So each style will have its pros and cons. For me personally as a coach, it's a discussion to be had with the athlete, taking into account maximizing the output against the risk of injury. Nice little spell in there for me, against the risk of injury. Though I have my preference, which is normally the lift that will ensure the lifter is able to minimize injury and maintain progressive blocks of training. So which one do I prefer? I prefer a basic arch or a decent stable arch using a lot of leg drive as best as possible. That is always going to be my preference because the other two at the moment, for me, they contact too much risk of injury in smaller joints. So we come through and have a look at the two different types of powerlifting variants. So we have your low arch bench, and these are typical generalizations. They generally suit larger or longer limbed lifters. And there's reasons for that depending on the angles that you have. They typically elicit more force mechanically. I will explain more of that as we go through. They have a greater range of movement and they have more elbow flexion as they go through. You then have the higher arch bench. Typically, it suits smaller and more athletic, more mobile lifters. There's a typical higher risk of injury, and as I said already, that's not in the major joints predominantly, that's going to be in the smaller joints. So you're looking at wrists, you're looking at elbow, you're looking at smaller spine positions and things like that, depending on what force is going through those joints. Typically, it elicits less force mechanically. That doesn't necessarily mean from A to B, it will be moving less weight, but it will elicit less force mechanically. And there's obviously a reduced range of movement and elbow flexion. So there's the kind of trade-offs that gives you with those two positions. More in slide 13. Just setting up. These are the kind of really important parts as we go through. I'm just going to double check and check there's no one in the waiting room. Perfect. Cool. So these are the important parts for setting up for me. Scapular attraction. Anyone that's done the deadlift and the squat, any teaching of that sort of stuff with me will know how important I feel scapular attraction is, certainly for maintaining a healthy position. Now, deadlift is obviously slightly more maximal by load, so you are going to get some form of flexion within that spine. Obviously, we're looking at flexing or bending the spine in a completely different pattern of movement here. So scapular attraction is going to the typical flat back setup on the left-hand side here. That's our normal old school standard bench press. Ideally, we want this one here, which gives us a nice retracted scapula. What it also does is, so it protects the spine, and I've got a nice list here. So it supports the shoulder joint and centers the head of the humerus. The humerus is that the bone that sits in that ball and socket joint. Ideally, we want it centered so it maintains as possible health as possible. The risk of injury is negligible, and it maintains that health along with the rest of the rotator cuff, which again, we need to have a healthy support through that because it stabilizes that joint. But in doing so, it also means, and as you can see from the range of movement from the top of his chest down all the way through to those hands, although he has his wrist contact, which frustrates me a little bit, but we'll come to that. The range of movement that he has to press through now is much less. So from a range of movement perspective, we have much less work to do. Supports the shoulder joint, center head of humerus, set up with the traps into the bed rather than the shoulder blades. So the only way we can actually get into that position, and actually so one of Susie's videos, I'll show you through towards the end, gives us a much better idea of how to set that through, is to set yourself up on the bench, which is why we see a lot of powerlifters set ourselves up nice and high with the feet and hips up on the bench. Set the traps into the bed first and then the hips down, followed by the feet, so that you can have that shortened range between the shoulders and the hips, enabling you to squeeze those shoulder blades back and down and keep in that position. If you set up with your shoulder blades or a flat backed bench, then you are going to be at risk of not being able to secure those shoulder blades nice and tight. Again, mentioned already, reduces that range of movement. Really nice cue, one that I know quite a few of my guys use already. So reaching that chest to the bar. So as we lower that bar to the chest, you then cue that sternum to reach that bar up. So chest to the bar will reach the sternum up, keeps that rib cage in a nice positive position. Helps you keep your shoulder girdle and allows you to make sure that that range of movement is as little as possible whilst keeping tension throughout that range of movement. Again, tension with any of those three major powerlifting movements is absolutely key. Breathing and bracing is also important. And if we don't have that nice big breath, we can't keep that tension. It also means that the chest is elevated, again, helps with that reach and decreases the range of movement still. Depending on the arch, it helps to maintain or neutral or stable spine position. So obviously, if we have that nice big arch, at no point as a coach can I sit there and go, well, that's a really nice neutral spine, because it's not neutral. However, it is still a safe and viable option for a powerlifting bench, so long as there is no movement through that spine and each of those sections of the spine throughout that movement. So next one that's important, grip. We're seeing quite a few in suicide grip. For those that don't know suicide grip, we have that thumb back grip so that it just sits in the hand. Does it work to an extent? I know, I've used a thumbless grip on a bench and on squats. I think Gary Allen's probably one of the ones that I did encourage to use a thumbless grip on the squat because it helped him feel the position that his hands and his shoulder girdle should be in to then go back to a thumbless or a thumbed squats grip on a low bar. I think we might have actually done that on bench as well, just to feel the right position. But ideally, we don't want that wrist cocked back. We don't want the wrist cocked forward. It needs to be directly under. And this one here gives us a nice example, left-hand side with the green. We almost want that bar loaded as low to the thumb on the bottom of that hand plate as possible, rather than up towards the knuckles, because we want that centered directly over that wrist joint in a punching position, so we can drive and force that way up and through, so that the elbow then stays directly underneath the wrist and we have that nice driven pattern of movement. Here's one that we might engage a little bit of conversation on. So most people have probably, I would hope by now, if they are powerlifting, have seen those three patterns of movement come out before. So the question I would pose is, why is there a difference in these three bar paths? So the blue line is the press, and the red line is bringing the bar down. So the bar comes down in a J curve in Bridges and Kazmaier. Bill Kazmaier, known as one of the best benchers in the world in his day. We have a very similar descent on both Bridges and Kazmaier. We have a very similar descent in the novice lifter, but the press itself, the ascent, is very, very different. So my questions to you will be, why is there a difference in those bar paths? What is causing those differences? What musculature in each of those three is generating the force to move the bar? We'll leave that last one to start with. Feel free to jump in as you see fit.
Is Kazmaier's due to his hip flexion? The fact that he's using his hips more to get that momentum from the start position?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So
because he's keeping it close and then driving through. Yeah,
so in essence, the difference in the three lifts, we've said already. So that one that I put on to start with, which is your general gym bro with a straight arm, straight line bench press, it's just using chest. It's a chest exercise. We're driving that chest. But if we want to elicit maximal force, ideally in a smaller arched bench, you're going to be using the legs as much as possible. So if you're not engaging and driving those legs to drive that bar back up the bench, then you're probably missing out. Most of the best benchers in the world are normally bigger lads. Not that there isn't any young ladies who are very good benchers. However, the guys that are seen as the best benchers tend to have a very, very good leg drive. The first 2 to 3 inches of that movement of the weight off of the chest is normally driven back slightly in conjunction with the legs and then pressed out with the rest of the triceps and the chest. And that's the main difference that we see with those drives. Kazmaier was just so much better at it than anyone else. So all of this section here was all kind of legs with an assistance from the arms, and then just a little press out at the top. But it's driven back towards the rest of the start position. Yeah, perfect. So we've said the difference in the musculature predominantly is that the novice weightlifter here, or the novice bench presser here, is probably going to be using predominantly a little bit of back, but mainly not using that scapular derived bench pressing technique, and they're only using the pectoral muscles to do so. Whereas Bridges and Kazmaier are going to be using all that leg drive, and then we look at how we can engage the leg drive and the knee and the hips to fit those patterns. Cool. So this is your kind of go-to standard. Probably should have had a picture from a different angle here. But we have a powerlifting bench press. And this is where we kind of talk more about all of the positions that we've got. So when you look at things like the foot position, we need to ask questions like, what are the feet trying to do? What is their purpose? And the answer for me is they are trying to help generate this bar path. So they're trying to get that weight up and back as fast as we can so we can add to the force that we're looking to elicit within that bar. But they have other jobs as well. So we need to also make sure that there's enough force here, keeping these hips on the bench and allowing us to send that force back and through. So if that foot position is so far back that all we're getting is flexion in the knee and then the hips come off the bench, then that weight is useless. So we need to make sure that wherever that foot position is, and for me, I'm not a massive fan of a really turned out foot position. And for me, generally that's because, and you almost start to see it here, is that when we look at eliciting the most force from the legs, generally it will be almost a jumping stance that we see in the weightlifting side of things. And certainly with squats, as we've already said before, the most force generated with the knee at 90 degrees means the shin should be almost vertical. But the biggest track we have is that the knees generally would track the toes. But as far as I'd be concerned here, if he pushes as forcefully as he can through those feet now, all that's going to happen is the knees are either going to come forward or they're going to drop in, depending on the strength of his glutes and the musculature on the outside of his quads. So how much of that force that he's additionally trying to generate is A, going to keep his glutes and bum on the bench, and B, is it going to transition into these? So that gives us a little bit of a cue on things like foot position. So for an arched bench press with a lower arch rather than a higher arch, I would probably have the feet slightly further forward and I would have the toes turned in slightly. However, when we have people who have benched for a long time, and Susie is probably a good example of this, you almost have to play with those positions a little bit, because if you've made lots of adjustments up here, we then need to have a play with an adjustment down here to see which is the strongest position in that pattern of movement to gain the most momentum as we can. So we've already discussed that foot position and knee position, so we'll kind of follow that through in, well, let's have a look at this. Well, the wrist and the position here is not too bad. For the lower arched position, I'm a big fan of making sure that at minimum you have that elbow position directly underneath the bar or just in front of the bar. In an ideal world, we want to kind of tuck these elbows to keep the shoulder girdle nice and tight. Head of humerus is nice and close and nice and stable within that joint, and those shoulder blades are pinched nice and tight. You can almost, and it's a cue that I've used a few times, have your elbows pointing to the back of the heels so that you're driving up and back towards that bench in that general direction. And the reason for this is that the more you have the elbow just behind or just in front of the bar towards the shoulder girdle, the less you're going to have from here. So you're almost working in counter to that leg drive that you're trying to achieve. So again, you can have the best position you want with the knees, with the feet and that leg drive. But if your elbow is not in the right position or that bar is not in the right position on the chest, then you're not going to be able to utilize that force that's kind of accumulating that whole body tension, which then brings us down to this chest position. Quite often, the best place to be coming to on that chest is the highest part of the chest. which in a simple view of the bench press, it would be ideal because it's decreasing the range of movement as much as possible. And you would like to think it would be generating as much force as possible. But that depends on a lot of things. That depends whether that chest position enables you to have that elbow position in the right place, to then have the feet and the hips in the right place to elicit this force all the way through and driving back towards that bar. So if the highest point on your chest doesn't enable you to have the elbows just in front of the bar, then you're again working in counter with this whole body tension that you're trying to create with that arched bench press. So in an ideal world, you want to have a look at that and fathom where it is. And you can only do that from recording from different positions. Head position is going to stay exactly the same every time. Execution. So we know we're already with bracing and tension through the deadlift and through the squat that we need that bracing and tension to keep that that maximal force creation. So as we take that from the rack, we want to take that nice big deep breath, reach that sternum up towards the bar, reach the chest nice and tall, keep that shoulder girdle nice and tight, almost feel like you're bending the bar and creating as much tension in that off back as possible. As you come down, you want to keep that breath, keep those elbows tucked. The elbows want to be just underneath the bar or just in front of the bar, down towards those heels. And as you then initiate that movement, we want to drive the bar as fast as we can, so keeping that leg drive going. So it shouldn't be just an initial token effort off those legs. Those legs should be constantly pushing you back towards the bench. And then you don't want to be breathing out or relaxing at all until you get somewhere towards over your sticking point or just over halfway. So we look at the musculature used. It's completely different to the original bench press that we saw. We are utilizing a lot of tricep, we are utilizing a lot of pectoral muscle, but by essence of mass and cross-sectional area, that musculature is not able to generate half as much force as this musculature is here. So if we didn't use this, then we'd be missing out. However, we look at someone who is a fantastic bencher, like Owen Hubbard, who has earned his crust with his bench press over many years. So this I've called the arched or reduced range of movement bench press. We look at the difference in these positions, and this, I mean, anybody that's seen Owen bench knows that he's probably looking at 2 to 4 inches on that bench press. As an 82, 83 lifter, he's in and around 200 kilos, maybe a little bit more. So for a weight moved, he is a fantastic number bench press. We look at all those key contributions. Foot position will come to in a minute, but with reaching that chest, the chest is nice and high. That punched position, excuse me, that punch fist position with those wrists is all there. Elbows are under the bar, if not just in front, and that shoulder blade is already engaged. So the main difference here is that whilst he is going to be using those legs for tension, and there is going to be some force generated from these legs, it's not going to be as much, and the bar path is going to be much different in this increased arched bench press. So there is much less flexion in those elbows. So there is much less work for it to actually do, which is why, although mechanically it's generating less force, it's moving more weight through a reduced range of movement, which it enables you to then obviously lift more weight. So obviously this is a much better position here for his knees tracking his toes. He's got a lot of tension through those feet and through those knees into those hips, keeping those hips on the bench. The idea behind this sort of stance is that it's stable rather than force generating. So the legs are there to maintain that arch and keep the tension there rather than to drive that bar back so much. There's going to be some force, but not as much as there would be in a slightly lower arch with those elbows directly underneath. So you'll find here, and Owen is a good example on the basis of his limb lengths, his elbows probably do come just underneath those wrists and press out. And obviously we've not really discussed that grip. So from an ideal world, we can take our grip out as far as 81 centimeters, as long as you have a single digit in contact with the outside ring. which means that you can reduce that range much more. Obviously, when I look to discuss things like injury reduction and things like that, and maintaining the ability to train, we have a lot of pressure then on those wrists. We have a lot of pressure on those elbows. I know that Jambo did come in with a really good question through the Crazy Strength page, and looking at, if you do train with an arch like this, would you train with the arch all of the time, or would you reduce the range to get a greater range of movement and an increase in strength? My honest answer from a coaching perspective is that I would probably mix it up. I would probably have one session a week with a nice big arch, and I would then kind of keep it minimized for the rest of it and develop strength in and around the shoulder girdle and that pressing strength. Obviously, for someone like James, he's already got a good pattern of movement with his squat and with his sumo deadlift now. Looking at the pattern of movement that we've looked at over the last 4 to 6 weeks, and I know that this leg strength is already there by comparison of that. So actually, this is something we can probably work on. I know that Jambo is probably getting excited by that now, but we don't see too much difference then. Those hip position, it's very low glute that's in contact with the bench, and this leg position is what we're looking at to keep that position. The difference between the two is that this one can be done quite quickly. This standard arched, getting a better position using leg drive, that can be taught fairly well. I say quickly. A decent arched bench press can be developed in 6 to 9 months. Depending on the athletic potential of the individual, probably age comes into it as well. You find generally that younger, more malleable athletes will settle more into this sort of position. It will take much less work to get into this position. But you're probably looking at a good 12 to 18, maybe even 24 months to really master this, whilst minimizing risk of injury and holding those positions. Some of the so there's Europeans, certainly the Swedish have been very good at this. I know there's a 66 lad who's benching close to 180, 200 kilos. His arch is absolutely phenomenal. I'd love to hate it, but it's a technical part of our sport. If you want to start whinging on the arch bench press and all that sort of stuff, then we want to start taking sumo and wide stance squats out as well. So it's part and parcel of the sport. Kind of brings us swiftly onto your assistance exercises. So for me, most of it ideally needs to be barbell specific, and it's a lot. The priority for me certainly with newer lifters is to make sure that that pattern of movement is technically sound, risk of injury is minimized as best as possible before we then start loading them up. And I would generally load up ideally with the barbell patterns of movement and keep it relatively simple. But then also look at where the technical element breaks down within the lift, and then prescribe from there. For me, again, those that tuned into the programming side of things with me in the summer, I think a lot of, I need to be careful how I phrase this, bear in mind I'm recording it. A lot of different programming styles tend to be very fashionable these days through social media, with lots of different crazy named styles of programming coming out. But for me, linear programming has its place within it, and basic linear programming, and that doesn't have to be the basic linear programming. That can be daily undulated programming and weekly undulated programming, as long as it has sufficient deload and ability to compensate and super compensate, then that will suffice. I know that only probably in the last 6 months have I started to add kind of more banded work and more of the conjugate style methods with Davey Watts, who has probably been at a good level for the last 5 to 6 years. We think it was Anderson squats we used for about 18 months. He got good progression linearly from Anderson squats, probably put a good 10 to 12 kilos on his back squat, because we analysed the position that was most weak and we worked on that. So looking at manipulating the tempo, block work works really well, but it's not always easy to do, even harder to do with COVID playing its part. Pause variants, Spoto press is one of those. Spoto press, unfortunately, it is reminiscent of your standard bro bench press that doesn't come all the way down to the chest, but it does work very similar to your block work in that you're pausing at a position which is an inch or two off the chest. Works a really weak position within that area and forces you to generate speed from that area. And changes in frequency and intensity. Benching, once you have that technical aspect, can be fairly tedious. So actually changing frequency and intensity tend to work very well for that. And again, the conjugate method side of things, banded and changed, so the accumulated resistance of speed work. So as you press, the weight in theory gets heavier, so you're pressing against a varied resistance or accumulated resistance. So it encourages your musculature to continue to work against that resistance as the weight gets easier or in an easier, more a more positive position angle-wise. So barbell non-specific work, dumbbell and tricep work is normally beneficial depending upon technique. Obviously, if you are having a lower arch version, then tricep work is going to be quite important. If you are going to have a high arched technique, then it's going to still be important, absolutely, but it's probably not going to be quite as important because the lockout shouldn't be quite as hard because you've got much less to do. Dumbbell work I find really, really positive, transitioning over to bench press on the basis that decent, see you later, Alicia. It works really nicely on the basis that it means that you're working almost unilaterally, and it means that you have to work with the stability side of things. It does also mean that you work for a greater range of movement. So as long as you're able to retract your scapula, it means that, Jim is late as always. If you're able to create that greater range of movement and come through a greater range of movement, you're then working and developing strength through different kind of patterns of movement, so it compensates for that side of things. If you don't need it, can you get ahead? Do you need it? So this is again another one from generally that has been increased in social media, although I do have a habit of over programming as well, but not normally with assistance works. Do you need it, and can you get it from the above? If you can already get it from the barbell specific side of things, your pattern of movement is already decent, then you don't need to over program that thing. And make sure that you keep it specific to the micro goal. So if your micro goal isn't feeding into your mesocycle and your macro cycle, then why does it need to be in there? If you generally want to work on the lockout and you're doing lots of pause work from the chest as assistance work, you're kind of missing the trick because that athlete's probably already strong working off the chest. So key takeaways for me, accept that it won't be perfect, but always work towards perfect and efficient. So it's a really hard balance of, and the Olympic lifters will know that I'm the same for this as well. And it's also the same for both the deadlift and for the squat. It's going to take a long time to get perfect and a long time to be 100% efficient if you ever get there. So accept that it won't always be perfect, but always work towards it. Don't let it get in your head too much. This is probably the biggest one for me for bench press. Setup is everything in order to maximize the most efficient way to elicit force. I know that there's 2 or 3 of my lifters in bench press sets that certainly when we're hitting kind of anything towards 2s and 3s over 85 to 90%, the first rep is normally really, really nice and absolutely bang on. And then the second or third repetition, just because the setup has moved or the hips are slightly in a different position because of that effort to press, or the shoulder girdle isn't quite in the same position so you can't get quite as much tension, the second and third reps are never quite as good. They're not going to be anyway because of the accumulated fatigue of those repetitions. But seeing a lift move rapid in the first lift and then it's so vastly different in the second and third, it's something that I've recommended a couple of times this week actually. Sometimes it might almost be easier to, even if you're doing a double or a triple, make the first lift, rack it, reset up, take the weight back out. It takes a lot more time, but I think it then forces you to work on that position and maintain those key positions, because at the end of the day on the platform, yes, you get 3 lifts, but you only get 1 lift or 1 opportunity to do it. Injury prevention is key in barbell sports, something I will live by through and through. If you're not on the platform or you're not in the training hall, then unfortunately, everyone else is making gains and you're not. So I can't bang on about this too much. I think I've got another one in there as well. But think about the big picture. You want to be able to train tomorrow and accumulate strength periodically. Again, that feeds into that one, and also feeds into mobility may well be key to a better bench. Even if you move from a flat back bench to a little arch, it's probably going to be the difference between 1 and 2 inches. Apparently, that makes all the difference. A nice little joke there. Indeed, 1 or 2 inches will make the difference in a bench press. It's the difference between eliciting a force through the bar that enables you to move that bar off the chest and not. You still need a good amount of stiffness. Wow, I didn't even check that when I wrote it. So you still need to have that stiffness within the tendons to be able to hold the joints in place to elicit that force. If you're too malleable or too pliable, you'll then not be able to hold the positions to elicit that force anyway. So it's a really hard balance. I won't start going into things like sliding filament theory, but sliding filament theory we did in a couple of ones. I'll maybe put a link to it when I put it up. If that filament is sliding over too much, it may not allow you to elicit the force. If it's not sliding over enough and you're too mobile, then you're not going to be able to maximize that force as well, and risk of injury could be higher either way. So it's finding that key balance. Unfortunately, unless you are a cadaver, we wouldn't be able to find out. And I've not had many people volunteer to become cadaver, so I can do science and science experiments on them so far. Health and performance go hand in hand. So this is probably my mental health go-to. There's a lot going down with mental health, and with lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 kind of kicking in, there seems to be a little bit of light coming with the whole vaccine side of things. But I'm a really big advocate of it's more than just the barbell, and I spend a lot of my time making sure that my athletes are okay. And I find that most people, if they're not okay off of the platform, they're not going to be okay in the training hall or on the platform. So from a coaching perspective, it's really important for me, for my athletes and anyone else that's out there. Most people that are here know me of old and have met me before. So if any advice is needed or anyone needs anything, then anybody's more than welcome to reach out. And I know there's a few of my lifters as well that would say exactly the same. Educate yourself and learn how the body works and reacts to things. Yeah, so that kind of brings us to that one seamlessly. Again, going back to Socrates, I cannot teach anyone anything, I can only make them think. It's definitely a two-way relationship. If you have a coach that is just telling you this is the right thing to do and this is do as I say kind of thing, it's never going to be the right coach for you. And unfortunately, we look at things like the Dunning-Kruger theories, which seems to be prevalent at the moment on Instagram. I think it's probably one I need to post if I actually get time. It's being able to educate yourself so that you can make good, refined decisions about a long-term goal. Again, positive mental attitude, and humans are all stupid. And that is your lot. But what I will do before I stop sharing is I will pop to, let's see, oh no, give me 2 seconds. I mean, we can always have a look at Gary's as well, but we'll see if we can share Susie's, see if it allows me to through the joy of, yes, it will do. Susie, you're going to be famous. There we go. Can we show this full screen? Yeah, we can. There we go, good. So this was Susie's attempt at a lower bench position. So we can see there we've got the feet roughly underneath the knee. It's just behind, so it is stabilizing a little bit. Glutes are on the bench, little bit of an arch, and we've got a nice close grip position. Takes it all the way down to the bench. We have a nice big breath. Still got those elbows directly underneath. We've got a punching position. This is a really nice demonstration of a kind of an entry-level powerlifting bench press. Still driving back, which is good. And we've got another rep for us as well. So it gives us a really good idea of that kind of first entry level. So any kind of sports, and in fact, I'll get this one up and I'll add to the that discussion. So we did get a lot of discussion on social media through I can't remember whose bench it was now. One of the girls' benches, who was a really good bench. We had some shaming going down. I think it went on a couple of decent websites as well throughout the through lockdown 1, talking about shaming the bench and the arch and all that sort of stuff. But for that last one, it's probably the minimum arch I would suggest you would have for sports-specific stuff, and gaining as much as you can out of that. So we can see this one here, we've gained a little bit more, so feet have come back slightly. We've got more tension through the legs, more drive through the legs, glutes are still in contact. We've got that nice elbow position as well, and the hands have come out slightly. So we can see that in between variant. And we can also see that the position on the chest has changed as well. So where that arch has come up, that position on the chest, it would normally be a little bit lower here. It's now come a little bit further up. And then we'll go to the last one. So I'll go back to it as well because she's very kindly shown me the good key talking point for the setup. Oh, Susie, your toes look lovely. As you won't hear that very often from me either. I hate feet. So this is where we look at getting that key setup. So we can see the grip here is a little bit wider, but it's not any of this back musculature that's in the bench. We're forcing those traps into the bench, and we're looking to keep it that way. We're up nice and high on the feet, so we can make sure that it is the traps in the bench. If you do this in a normal civvy gym, it does look really weird, and you get really strange looks. But I'm kind of all about the strange looks anyway. Most people know me. I cut around like for half my life anyway. So from there, we take those feet down, but point to note, she is still on those toes, so she can make sure she can really get those glutes in the right position before it comes down. And we're also taking the weight out before the feet and the glutes go down. I did this. My arch was nowhere near as good as Susie's is when I was a powerlifter. But it does mean that you're able to maintain this position much more, because once you put those feet and the glutes down, especially in a training element rather than a competition element, when you've got someone taking the weight out for you, you do lose that position. And as we've already said towards the end there, it's so key to get that position set up properly. It will be the difference between eliciting enough force and not. And then we'll see a nice, beautiful bench from Super Suze. So the position is very similar, but we can see the greater arch. We can see the position of the contact of the glutes. Knees are staying nice and stable. And we can see, I'll go back so we can have another look. You can see those legs driving that bar back. Elbows are just in front of the bar. Perfect. And that, I think, gives you a nice whistle-stop tour. Humans in and around the bench press. Happy to take questions. Take yourself off mute if you wish. Nothing. In which case, I shall stop the recording.